Welcome to Paranormality Magazine. Each week, Paranormality Magazine explores all Fortean subjects, from phantoms to UFOs and every cryptid creature in between. Each week, you're treated to a collection of well-researched and investigated stories, interviews, and reports on cutting-edge paranormal projects and topics they know you crave. And here in the podcast, I share stories from the magazine to give you just a taste of what you receive in every issue. I'm Darren Marlar, and this is Paranormality Magazine. The following is an article from Paranormality Magazine in the May 2024 issue. It's An Unknown Compelling Force, Preternatural Insight into the Tragic Dyatlov Pass Incident of 1959, written by Kirsty Beth.
We're going camping, 10 of us, and it's a great bunch of people. I have all the warm clothes I need, so don't worry about me. A letter from hiker Zenaida Kolmogorova as cited in BBC News' Mystery of Dyatlov Pass, 2019.
It was a particularly dreadfully cold day in February, and I was sprawled on the living room couch watching TV under a weighted blanket and a snoozing cat. In typical Wisconsin winter fashion, we'd experienced a rare but impressive, according to weather.gov, storm system which dumped over a foot of snow in the span of 48 hours, followed by an F2 tornado within the same week. Seasonal depression was in full force, and Mother Nature was not immune. She was confused, and she was ticked. It felt like the pandemic all over again, existing in a bubble of, quote, safer at home, unquote, while the winds howled and the patio creaked with the ever-growing weight of snow. There was truly nothing else to do but hunker down and binge some provocative paranormal television. So I accepted my fate. I watched a series sharing legends of evil places throughout the world. Places cursed, places forgotten by history, places like Russia's Ural Mountains. Here, the indigenous Mansi people reported fireballs in the sky and colorful orbs winking in and out among the barren landscape. Here, geologists discovered microscopic coiled springs made of modern tungsten, a rare metal nanotechnology used in missiles, yet buried under thousands of years of soil. Otherwise known as Russia's Area 51, the Ural Mountains are a 1,600-mile range of ancient, rugged terrain stretching from the tip of the Arctic Ocean to what is now modern-day Kazakhstan. Mountaineers, geologists, and archaeologists alike have been drawn to this area for hundreds of years in search of adventure, gold, and other precious minerals. The vast area of Siberia is as weird as it is wild, with one particularly inhospitable area known as the cryptic "Don't Go There" by legends of the Mansi tribe. Mount Otorden is also known through other loose native translations as Mountain of the Dead and even Mountain with Swirling Winds by other researchers. Those who are willing to hike such a treacherous passage must at least be Grade 3 certified hikers because of its rough and often hazardous terrain. In 1959, a strong-willed group of experienced hikers from what was then the Ural Polytechnic Institute in Yekaterinburg, Soviet Union, was determined to make it to the top of the ominous mountain. The group of 10 ranged from college age to mid-30s, 8 men and 2 women, veterans and athletes, a mix of trades including radio engineering, power economics, and nuclear physics. One of the hikers, Yuri Yudin, was forced to turn back early on in the trip due to a sciatic and arthritis flare-up. His comrades bid him a cheerful farewell and continued their journey up the mountain pass. Their final days would be documented on 5 cameras and various journals scattered among their frozen, battered corpses. Yuri would later have the grim task of helping identify the bodies of his friends and their belongings. Like a drawn-out spring thaw, I slowly became obsessed with this notable cold case over the next several weeks. Additional documentaries were watched, library books were loaned, YouTube was scoured. Turns out lots of people are perplexed and obsessed with this case, and everybody has opinions ranging from Soviet conspiracies, alien attacks, energy vortices, and abominable snowmen. Everybody came to the same conclusion. Nobody truly knows what happened to the hikers. In fact, all the evidence points to the notion that the hikers may have not even known what happened to themselves. Now, one must remember when gazing upon those old black-and-white photographs that the world at that time wasn't. Trees were green, skies were blue, and people's cheeks were rosy. But up there on the mountain of the dead, the world of Cold War Soviet Union, it was a barren world where 9 hikers trekked their way through February's well below freezing temperatures, wind gusts firing Arctic sleet that felt like razors to exposed skin, into a black-and-white world of skeletal trees, gray skies, and the vicious kiss of frostbite to exposed cheeks. Even in black-and-white photos, we can still imagine the wavy yellow hair, stoic jawline, and childlike smile of lead mountaineer Igor Dyatlov, for whom the infamous passage was later named. He saw an unexplored and challenging world of potential in those ancient mountains, and no one doubted his ability to lead with passion and utmost precaution for the dangerous expedition ahead. Yet he would be found 3 weeks later, clutching a handful of frantically broken branches, frozen into the earth. His hair would no longer be yellow, but white. His mother would only be able to identify him from the gap between his front teeth. Indeed, Mount Ortoden was cursed. On the 10th day of the trip, February 1st, bad weather and rapidly dwindling sunlight forced the group to set up camp on the eastern slope of the mountain, even though they were not far from the summit. What occurred next would baffle the world for the next 60-plus years.
I wonder what awaits us in this trip. What will we encounter? Everyone's falling asleep, and behind the window, Ural taiga is spread in all directions. A diary entry of Zinaida Kolmogorova, January 23, 1959.
A partially collapsed tent buried under several feet of snow was discovered 2 weeks after the group was expected back from their expedition. The military search and rescue party had made the discovery on the eastern slope of Holichal Mountain at a height of 1,079 meters. An ice pick lay at the entrance of the tent along with a still-working flashlight and part of a fur jacket. When members of the search party peered inside the tent, they discovered blankets, rucksacks, and boots lined up neatly side by side, and additional skis aligned horizontally for added support and insulation. BBC News journalist Lucy Ash noted in her 2019 article Mystery of the Dyatlov Pass that there was also a route map, official papers, money, and a flask of alcohol. Next to that was a plate full of sallow, white pork fat, a Slavic delicacy. Knives, axes, and other tools were also present. It's as if the hikers simply vanished in the middle of setting up their supplies and breakfast for the next day. Upon further investigation of the abandoned tent, authorities were quick to notice the back had been deliberately cut open with a knife. Later in the forensic investigation, a professional tailor inspected the tent and confirmed it had been a deliberate slash made with a knife in 3 places, from the inside. Something caused the hikers to abandon their tent, their only tent, evidently in a fit of terror or panic. As authorities continued to investigate, they came across a distinct set of footprints leaving the area of the tent down the slope into an area of scattered trees and a ravine roughly half a mile away. The group had not fled to their cache site elsewhere on the mountain pass but directly into a forest. The tracks appeared orderly and indicative of a single-file structured line of descent, a stark contrast to the obvious panic as evidenced by the 3 slashes in the tent. The tracks also indicated several members of the party were not wearing shoes. There was clearly a threat of exceptional danger for the extremely experienced group of hikers to abandon their tent and not even take any sort of protection or even proper footwear. The mystery was about to deepen and take an even more perplexing turn. The first body was Yuri Doroshenko at the edge of the forest, partially covered in snow. The charred remains of a small fire pit were also present. He was wearing only a short-sleeved t-shirt and swimming trunks, wool socks, and no shoes. His clothes are brutally shredded and pieces have been torn off. He lay atop a pile of branches and was covered in scrapes and bruises. Strangely, he was also found with burns on the right side of his head and to the left side of his foot. There was a grayish fluid near his mouth that in forensic science is indicative of a strong force to the chest. Yuri Krivonishenko was found near Doroshenko in similar torn attire, notably a long-sleeved shirt and one sock, also covered in cuts and scratches, and had sustained third-degree burns to his legs and hands. His eyes and lips were missing. He too was covered in cuts and scratches and blood. The investigators began to take a closer look at the men's immediate surroundings. A nearby cedar tree held a major clue – broken branches up to 16 feet into the canopy. Doroshenko must have climbed the cedar tree, cutting and snapping down branches for firewood as he went, and then had fallen, perhaps into the fire pit? Or onto the frozen ground below, breaking his sternum? Or did they both climb the tree, fleeing from something, and then fall into the fire pit from exhaustion? Yet the coroner would rule both of their deaths as hypothermia. Another keen-eyed investigator recognized that all the branches torn from the cedar tree were all facing the same direction. Not only were the terrified and freezing men desperately scrambling for branches to create a fire, but it seemed as though they were clearing a visual path directly back to the tent. As if they were watching something, keeping an eye on something, waiting for something to happen again. What was even more puzzling was the livor mortis, a pooling of blood post-mortem, identified on the front of the frozen bodies. This would indicate the men died while laying on their stomachs in a prone position, perhaps having fallen from the tree, and then later, after death had settled in, were flipped back over and rested on their backs, almost purposely and respectfully. The investigators and search parties were hopeful that meant that the other hikers may still be alive somewhere after checking on their deceased friends. A chunk of Krivonishenko's own knuckle would later be found in his mouth, the grisly remains of a scream that was swept away by the mountain of swirling winds. It would be 2 more months before the remaining hikers' bodies would be found.
Weather so far is smiling at us. It's only -8 degrees Celsius outside. After dinner, we sit for a long time around the campfire and sing heartfelt songs. Then we resume our discussions, mostly about love. Group Diary Entry, January 28, 1959.
Elsewhere on the Urals around Mount Ortorden, another group of brave hikers were passing through and would later note on February 1, 1959, they saw a strange phenomenon in the evening to the north, the extremely bright light of some rocket. The light was so bright that even those hikers who were preparing to sleep in tents went out to look at it. What sounded like thunder also came from the area where the light was seen. This date and time frame is significant, as it is the same time the Dyatlov hikers had disappeared. A Soviet hiker named Vladislav Karelin and his comrades witnessed a strange celestial phenomenon on the night of February 17th. "I rushed out of my sleeping bag and tent without boots, just in socks, stood on branches and saw a large light spot, and it also grew bigger," he recalled. Similar light orb sightings occurred on March 17th by meteorologists, soldiers, and other hikers in the area. A Dyatlov search party even witnessed what they deemed energy bundles unexplained by modern science on March 31st. Could the Soviet military have been conducting clandestine weapons testing in the area that frightened the hikers out of their tents in the middle of the night? Or could there have been something as simple as a freak snowstorm? The effect of catabolic winds and a phenomenon known as the Kármán vortex street have been known to create small but destructive Arctic tornadoes in the region, and tornadoes have been known to create orbs and would have also been described as eerie giant puffballs inside of a funnel cloud. Tornadoes and katabatic winds can create a terrifying noise, a shrill whistle, a sound both beautiful and terrifying, noted researcher and mountaineer Donnie Eicher in his 2013 book Dead Mountain, The Untold True Story of the Dyatlov Pass Incident. Perhaps this noise and/or the naturally occurring light orbs could have caused the hikers to become fearful and disoriented and flee their tent without their boots and head toward what they thought was a safe distance from the phenomenon. Eicher reflected on his time hiking the Dyatlov Pass in 2011, saying, "In the winter, in the northern Ural Mountains, there can be strong winds and sometimes whirlwinds. Various sounds arise in the mountains, terrifying and the foreign. You get scared when you're there, and those who haven't heard anything like that can become frightened." From seasonal allergies to achy joints when a storm is brewing, weather and atmospheric phenomena can certainly have a profound internal effect on the human body. The extremely high intensities of compressed air swirling through an Arctic mountain storm can create low-frequency sound waves which people cannot explicitly hear, but they can feel. This is known as infrasound. In fact, it wasn't until 1960, a year after the Dyatlov Pass incident, that researchers accidentally discovered the effects of infrasound on the human body, including feelings of nausea, earaches, mild irritation and disorientation, and shaking equipment by an unseen force in laboratory settings. With research into the properties and effects of infrasound only having been funded since the early 2000s, the 1960s scientists' repeated and prolonged exposure to infrasound resulting in severe illness would have been baffling to them, a set of circumstances that seemed to point to phenomena beyond their understanding. Some of the investigators suggested that an avalanche had occurred, rather than gale-force Arctic winds, partially burying the hikers in their tent, and they cut themselves free because they couldn't breathe. The area of Dyatlov Pass was categorized as a Category 2 avalanche risk zone, according to the Russian Federation Natural Hazards Handbook of the time, meaning there was one avalanche per every half-mile every 10 years, January and February being the most active and dangerous months. While there are few official records of avalanches occurring in the specific area of the Ural Mountains where our hikers met their fate, the irregular topography of the mountain, combined with the location of the hiker's tent, combined with the snowfall induced by incredibly strong katabatic winds, could have led to such an avalanche, creating severe yet non-fatal injuries to the hikers who later died of hypothermia. But others, including avalanche experts at the time, discredit this idea. Even one of the radiograms from the lead investigator asked why were things left in the tent if people were swept away by wind. The hypothetical avalanche was in a location that was not appropriately steep enough for an avalanche to theoretically occur. Swiss geotechnical engineering researchers Alexander Puzrin and Johann Guam conducted their own research on the Dyatlov incident and the mechanisms of what are known as slab avalanches, saying, "Something unexpected happened after midnight that caused expedition members to cut the tent from the inside and escape towards a forest more than 1 kilometer away, without appropriate clothes, under extremely cold temperatures and in the presence of strong katabatic winds induced by the passing of an Arctic cold front. It makes it more difficult to trace avalanche signs, especially 26 days after the incident. Given the extremely low temperatures and strong katabatic winds, it is unlikely that anyone would have climbed above the tent during the night, disturbing the weak layer in the absence of significant snowfall. The only way to accumulate additional load is through wind transport." Unquote. In late January 2022, professional mountaineers Oleg Demenyenko and Dmitry Borisov attempted to visit Dyatlov Pass on snowmobiles. Like the ill-fated hike 63 years previous, the mountaineers' 600-pound vehicles were overturned by wind gusts on several occasions. The weather quickly deteriorated as it had when Dyatlov's group attempted to hike the summit. Once visibility briefly improved, the mountaineers discovered traces of what are known as slab avalanches. Slab avalanches can occur when a layer of snow positioned on top of a weaker layer gets dislodged by a relatively small trigger, like the pitching of a tent, and dislodge a chain of potentially fatal events. Like Puzrin and Guam found in their research, these types of avalanches can dissolve under certain conditions, like additional snowfall, leaving virtually no sign of them ever having occurred. Did the Dyatlov hikers encounter a once-in-a-lifetime Arctic storm, an insurmountable force of nature that produced deadly vortex of atmospheric, infrasonic, and geomagnetic energies, scaring them out of their only means of protection? Were the balls of light and peals of thunder witnessed by other hikers in the area around that same time the eerie byproduct of the storm that ultimately killed the hikers?
At the moment, we're sitting and singing songs. Guys play the guitar, Rustum plays along with the mandolin. Catches your heart. This is the last place of civilization, and it is rare that we meet people like that. Diary entry of Ludmila Dobenyina, January 27, 1959.
The group's leader, Igor Dyatlov, was found shortly after Doroshenko and Krivodeshchno. He was surrounded by branches in a thicket roughly 1,000 feet away from the cedar tree, face up, clutching a birch branch, his face, ankles, and knuckles covered in bruises and scratches. His watch had stopped at 5:31 a.m. While he sustained no internal injuries, he was not wearing any footwear except 2 mismatched socks. The coroner ruled he too had died of hypothermia. Approximately 1,000 feet away, further from the cedar tree, was the body of Zinaida Kolmogorova in the fetal position, her nose broken and bruises throughout her body. She was better dressed with 2 hats, a long undershirt, but still no shoes and sleeves were torn off. It appears she'd been trying to scramble uphill toward the tent. Hers would be the first death labeled as hypothermia, due to a violent accident. By the following week, on March 5th, authorities had uncovered the badly mutilated body of Rustam Slobodin, midway between where Dyatlov and Kolmogorova had been found, appearing as if he too had been frantically trying to reach the tent. His remains, however, told a more gruesome and puzzling story. He was lying face down in the snow. His face was deeply discolored, and he had sustained a blunt force to the back of the head. Forensics had found encrusted snow around his mouth and nose, which indicate he was still breathing for some time after he had fallen. He was wearing 2 long shirts, 2 pairs of pants, 2 pairs of socks, and 1 boot. Curiously, he did not have any injuries to his hands, indicating perhaps he had sustained a blow to the head and then fell unconscious, face first into the snow. Nothing was making sense to the investigators. They had multiple bodies in various stages from frozen decomposition and various stages of dress and undress, with injuries that did not fit the typical pattern of those fallen by avalanches or hypothermia. The causes of death were vague, and the circumstances even more mysterious. Was this an accident, a homicide, or something else entirely? Inconclusive autopsies were done. Hasty funerals had rumors spreading as top officials began to resign from the case. Nobody had any idea what bizarre calamity had befallen the community's beloved hikers. Nobody could understand how the hikers' bodies could be so mutilated while the nearby snow and trees remained untouched. The culprit became known as a selective and unknown compelling force, and the spring thaw could not come quickly enough.
Diary is written in the cold on the go. Group diary entry, January 30, 1959.
There's been extensive research done on the correlation between balls of light in the sky or unidentified aerial phenomenon and geoseismic/geomagnetic activity. For the last 2 decades, Russian scientist Dr. Alexei Dmitriev has studied naturally occurring vortex phenomena, which includes ball lightning, natural self-luminous objects, and even instances of poltergeist activity, and other glowing forms that are associated with earthquakes and volcanoes. He believes that tornadoes, whether on the ground or in the mountains, can transform gravitation and spin-force vortices into electromagnetic energy, which can take the form of photons and other spherical light orbs in the immediate area of the event. Such atmospheric and geoseismic chaos could explain the orbs and balls of light witnessed by not only the Mansi tribes for thousands of years and by search parties throughout the investigation, but the strange celestial phenomenon witnessed by the Carolyn Party on the same night the Dyatlov Party met their fate. Tornadoes and other severe weather systems are also more likely to form over areas with geological faults, and it's no coincidence that the area of the Dyatlov Pass falls directly on the main Uralian fault line. Mountaineer and writer Danny Eicher knows the repetitive wind events of the Ural Mountains well, having traversed the infamous Dyatlov Pass in 2011. Saying, "It would be difficult to come up with a more ideal confluence of weather and landscape to create vortices. These would have been screaming right outside the hikers' tents, creating an intense discomfort and fear that they couldn't begin to understand, feeling vibrations in the ground and a roar that seems to pass from west to east like the roar of a freight train. Their chest cavities begin to vibrate from the infrasound created by the stronger vortex now passing." Perhaps the storm, in and of itself, did not kill the hikers. If it had, there would be environmental evidence of such a storm. Yet the forest and the cedar tree remained unscathed by the power of nature. Perhaps the light orbs, the byproduct of the storm, are what killed the hikers. Up to this point, it's known that the Ural Mountains are indeed a hotbed of UAP and UFO-like activity, as evidenced by the stories of the Mansi tribe, the evidence of futuristic technologies buried within the earth, and the admittance, under oath, by several search party locals of orange spheres over the sky. Destructive and electrically charged vortices screaming down a mountain at sub-zero temperatures would certainly be a sight to befell. It's one thing to witness light orbs or Arctic tornadoes in the mountains from afar. It's another thing to put your body in the center of it. The discovery of the remaining bodies would flip this entire investigation upside down.
We've been looking for a place, then we returned about 200 meters back. Charming place, dead wood, high pines, in short, everything you need for a good night. Group diary entry. All would perish within 24 hours. January 30, 1959.
By May, the snow had begun to melt, exposing new clues to areas that had been previously buried. A Mansi native and his dog found several pieces of shredded and cut clothing abandoned in the snow roughly 200 feet from the cedar tree. This included an inside-out vest, a pair of trousers, a wool sweater, and a torn trouser leg. A nearby creek bed had begun to melt and was mostly slush, bringing forth more abandoned clothing. The other half of the trousers and what was later identified as Ludmila Dubinina's sweater. Investigators found her on a small ledge of the creek bed as if she were trying to climb it. Her face had largely decomposed from resting in the creek for nearly 4 months, her teeth and cheekbones exposed from the water flowing into her mouth. Her tongue and hypoglossal muscles of her mouth were noted as missing per the medical examiner, and blood in her stomach suggested she'd been alive when this gruesome injury occurred. She had sustained 10 broken ribs, crushed like eggshells with bones embedded in her heart, causing massive thoracic hemorrhage. Dubinina's death would be the only death ruled as something besides hypothermia. She had been wearing 2 sweaters and 2 shirts belonging to Yuri Krivonichekno, with 2 socks on one foot and the other foot wrapped in a torn sweater. The nature of her injuries was consistent with the crushing internal injuries of that of a bomb shockwave. The remaining hikers' bodies were recovered together in the creek bed. Semyon Zolotaryov appeared better dressed, wearing 3 pairs of pants, 2 hats, 2 jackets, a scarf and boots. His camera was around his neck, a notepad and pen in his hand. Strangely, one of the investigators indicated he's written nothing on the notepad and stuffed it in his own pocket. It was never formally filed into evidence. Curiously, it seemed he had fled the tent in the middle of the night with his camera around his neck. Further inspection of its film concluded it was damaged by water, but other investigators think Zolotaryov was trying to photograph something bright against the midnight sky before he perished. His eyes held no clues. They had decomposed long ago. While Zolotaryov was most prepared to face the frigid wilderness, he'd suffered the worst injuries of the hikers found so far. His massive internal injuries included several broken ribs on his right side, and his skull was exposed from a deep gash on the back of his head. He had been crippled and crushed by a high amount of pressure, notes one report. Forensics compared his injuries to that of someone whose chest, like Yuri Doroshenko's, was crushed during a car accident. Yet there was no skin bruising, a hematoma, to mirror the broken bones beneath, which is highly unusual if not impossible. It was as if he too internally combusted and sustained severe hemorrhaging from a large force while still alive. Alexander Kolevatov was found behind Zolotaryov in a fetal embrace, presumably trying to protect Zolotaryov's body or stay warm. His jacket and pants were ripped and sustained burn marks. His face had largely decomposed, but it was evident that both his nose and his neck had been broken, and there was a gash behind his right ear. Like his friends before him, his death too was ruled hypothermia. A final body lay in the creek bed, and it was that of Nikolai Thibault-Brignol. He was better dressed, wearing 2 pairs of boots and several layers of clothes. He too sustained shocking and disturbing injuries from a powerful force that could not have been caused by a human. The dome of his skull had been crushed, and he succumbed to a massive cerebral hemorrhage. Investigators and forensic experts concluded that this violent of an injury could not have occurred simply by falling into the rocky creek bed from a standing height. Like the injuries of his comrades, it would be classified as the effect of a large force that had killed him in under 3 hours. Investigators were beginning to consider the possibility that this was not an avalanche or a sudden snowstorm. These were not the sort of injuries of those who succumbed to an avalanche. Moreover, why would Zolotaryov and Kolmogorova from earlier still have two hats on if they were swept up in a snowstorm? There was another puzzling finding on the remains of the final four hikers. Not only did their clothing contain traces of radioactive particles, but their clothing wasn't even theirs to begin with. Kolovatov's trousers and one of the shirts Lyudmila Dubinina was wearing were later found to belong to Yuri Krivonichenko. The slight positive radioactive result, identified by medical examiners, could be explained by environmental contamination, argues Danny Eicher in his 2013 research. He argued that it's possible that nuclear tests over 800 miles away have made their way to the northern Urals through atmosphere and water. Other researchers into the case noted that both Kolovatov and Krivonichenko had previously worked in nuclear facilities prior to the doomed expedition, arguing that the hikers' clothing was nowhere near an abnormal range of radiation levels. But that still doesn't explain why their clothes had been swapped.
Dinner's in the tent. Nice and warm. Can't imagine such comfort on the ridge, with howling wind outside, hundreds of kilometers away from human settlements. Diary entry of Igor Dyatlov, who would die within 12 hours of this entry. January 31, 1959.
Avalanches, light orbs, catabolic vortices, infrasonic explosive waves, Soviet conspiracies. 60-plus years following the usual circumstances surrounding these 9 hikers' deaths, we are still at a loss for what may have caused such catastrophic, unusual, and varied injuries of all who perished less than a half a mile from one another. What I'm able to infer from the research I've done creates the following theoretical timeline. 1. Semyon Zolotaryov and Rustem Slobodin had been standing outside of the tent at the time the primary source or force of terror caused them to alert their fellow hikers. Zolotaryov and Slobodin were better dressed in their own clothing and may have been outside the tent taking a leak, as evidenced by small traces of urine found near the side of the tent. 2. The remaining 7 flee the tent, some cutting through the back with a knife, which curiously has never been found, and everybody makes a beeline for the tree line for shelter and means to make a fire until the primary source or force of terror subsides. 3. Everyone, possibly, began stripping and breaking branches from the cedar trees to create a fire and keep an eye on the tent from a distance for reasons unknown. Perhaps they feared that the primary source or force of terror would strike again. From here, the exact timeline gets fuzzy. A. At some point, Lyudmila Dubinina, Nikolai Thibault-Brignol, Semyon Zolotaryov, and Alexander Kolovatov travel further into the ravine where they dig out a small den and lay down branches. It's not clear if they did this during a point I'll describe in a moment. After this moment, or perhaps initially after running into the forest. Perhaps they got separated from the rest of the group for reasons unknown. Now about that point. Sometime in this, Yuri Doroshenko and Yuri Krivonichenko are killed, fell out of a tree due to losing strength possibly, or fell victim to a secondary source or force of terror, and they landed on or near their campfire. It's clear they died in agony as they both displayed self-inflicted injuries that are consistent with someone freezing or burning to death, biting hand, scratching or beating yourself, but also had crush injuries that didn't fit the typical patterns of falling from a tree. C. At some point, either during or after the scenario 3B I just described, Igor Dyatlov, Zinaida Kolmogorova, and Rustem Slobodin all attempt to head back to the tent but are separated due to weather or snow blindness, darkness, disorientation. After the above scenarios, Lyudmila Dubinina, Nikolai Thibault-Brignol, Semyon Zolotaryov, and Alexander Kolovatov, unclear if some or all of this group, return to the cedar tree or fire pit area and frantically strip off clothing from Doroshenko and Krivonichenko. Dubinina donning Krivonichenko's jacket for added warmth, Kolovatov donning Doroshenko's burned jacket. They lay the bodies of their fallen, stripped comrades side by side out of respect. Next, it appears they then returned to the den and laid some of Doroshenko and Krivonichenko's radioactive clothing on top of the branches in the den. It's not clear why they would not just put these clothes on, as they knew they were actively freezing to death. Perhaps they were going to use the additional clothing as means to make a fire. Next, Igor Dyatlov, Zinaida Kolmogorova, and Rustem Slobodin, still facing the direction of the tent, are ultimately killed by a violent force, perhaps that secondary source or force of terror which also killed Doroshenko and Chris Vonashenko. Then, Lyudmila Dubinina, Nikolai Thibault-Brignol, Semyon Zolotaryov, and Alexander Kolovatov die in a creek bed only a few feet from their den. Why would they leave their den, which had spare clothing and branches, for a fire? Had they attempted to check on Igor or Zenaida or Rustam only to succumb to the same secondary force or force of terror? If I could ask God just one question, it would be what really happened to my friends that night. Yuri Yudin, sole survivor of the Dyatlov Pass incident. The Mountain of the Dead had wrapped its icy, gnarled hand around 9 determined and fiercely passionate hikers who refused to leave any of their comrades behind. By 3 a.m., only the waning crescent moon bore silent witness to their final terrifying moments. Rumors would circulate for the next 65 years, ranging from natural cause of death to criminal, and every paranormal category in between. Even though the circumstances are mysterious, one thing is concrete among all the evidence. All of the hikers fought tooth and nail to the very end. They died scared, and they died cold, but they did not die alone. I can't help but wonder how this event would have unfolded in modern times. The Dyatlov group would have their own social media presence, would have crowdfunded for their expedition, would have live-streamed every moment of their journey on a selfie stick and late-night hashtags. Their families and friends could be with them in their journey, their exact location noted by GPS coordinates. Perhaps in 2024 it would not have been characterized as a group led by Igor Dyatlov. Perhaps it would have been named for one of the 2 females instead. Medical examiners and investigators did the best they could with the information, knowledge, and technology available to them at the time. One can only theorize how the technology and forensic investigations of modern times might have led to different hypotheses on the hikers' brutal journey into the mountains. The 1959 Dyatlov Pass incident is one of the most puzzling and conspiracy-laden mysteries in Soviet history. I found myself consumed by a similar unknown force when researching this topic throughout the months of February and March of 2024, during a time of strange weather in my own neck of the Northern Hemisphere. I would classify this case as one which is preternatural, a nod to parapsychologist Dr. Barry Taff as a process which is unknown to us now but will eventually be understood, as opposed to supernatural, whereby the phenomenon lies beyond the scope of human understanding altogether. Yuri Yudin, the 10th hiker of the group who had to turn back for health reasons, lived a solitary life and passed away in 2013. He'd given several interviews about his experience and his theories on what may have happened to his friends. He was of the belief that they succumbed to a Soviet weapons testing cover-up until the day he died, suggesting they had run into a place where they shouldn't have gone. They accidentally turned out to be witnesses and were poisoned, he said in one of his final interviews featured on DyatlovPass.com. It was an elemental force of the enemy that they were afraid of, not hurricanes. These guys were adequate in any situation, he said. After Yudin's death, friends clearing his apartment noted it was covered in old newspaper clippings and unfinished manuscripts surrounding the Dyatlov Pass incident. It was the den of an old man, caught up by an unknown, compelling force that we only now understand as reclusive remorse. His ashes were buried next to the remains of his friends in Mihailovsko Cemetery. Thanks for listening to Paranormality Magazine. Get more information about the magazine and subscribe to our monthly publication at ParanormalityMag.com. That's ParanormalityMag.com. Or click the link in the show description. And if you're a researcher or investigator, send us your stories. We might feature you in our next issue. If you have a paranormal podcast, you can add it to our website so our readers can find your show. And artists, if you'd like your work to be featured in our magazine or on our back cover, contact us. Again, our website is ParanormalityMag.com. I'm Darren Marlar, and I'll have more paranormal for you next time from Paranormality Magazine.